Good evening, palettes and mercs. So, as promised, I am going to be reacting to the Clan Primers Part 1. It only took 2 months to get here, if not more. The editor will probably correct me, which is funny, because that's just future me, and I have to relive these horrors twice, because the original video is about 2 hours. Obviously, we are not going to cover all that because I have a tendency to go on rants quite a bit. And yes, we've left off the helmet because we're going to be getting into the thick of it here. So I'm going to stop yapping for a little bit and we'll get this rolling. All right, Battletech Mech Warrior Lore, a primer on the clans, Part 1. And you know this is going to be a long time if Tex here is splitting it up into 2 parts, at that very least. Let's go ahead and get into it. Okay. It's nice to see how far the editing has come, even over this, what I think, 13... Gosh, I want to say 16.
Folks, please take your seats. I'm glad you could find your way to the classroom today. My apologies, as the head of personnel had to scramble to put this shitbox together, but for our purposes, it will work just fine. We should...
First off, I gotta say, I love the pixelated art sort of style. We got your bat shawls over here in the corner. We'd love to see it. Also, don't want to know what happened to that airlock. Anyways,
be fine assuming the station doesn't explode, which it almost certainly doesn't with terrifying regularity. Anyways, let me log in with my ID here, and we'll just ignore that for now.
Yes,
Eyes up front, and please ignore the noise. So initially, this lecture was going to be relatively brief, as I had originally wanted to talk about every Inner Sphere mech warrior's worst nightmare. These assholes from beyond the deep periphery in their attempts to party crash the Inner Sphere one battle at a time. This lecture was originally focused on Clanner elementals only, their power armor, battle history, and then afterwards to let you guys decide whether they were either first-rate murder hobo shock troops or merely convenient footballs for your assault.
See, here's the thing though. I really love the battle armor and wish it had actually, no, it has a good presence in the Battletech scene. I just want to see it a little bit more often. So because of this, in honor of Tex, yet again, we're going to be seeing more battle armor. But I'm probably going to do it right this time and just do it on the main save instead of trying to splinter off into another whole fiasco like the Hetzer. We're still coming back to that because that was a whole lot of fun. But our dear elemental friends, I hope we get to learn a little bit more about them today, as well as the clans, but seems like the video is evolving very quickly.
Lance, we even had a good tagline for this initial production.
Oh?
But that was before I read my mountain of messages.
Yes, they do explode.
My backlog of emails, and the numerous other inquiries I had received. You see, I had made what we call in the education business a fucking boo-boo. I put the spotlight of historical inquiry onto a big subject, and as a result, people had a multitude of follow-up questions. Which I suppose is my own damn fault. After all, I'd followed up a major history lecture two-parter with a relatively brief history on a middling, if borderline, generic General Motors product. Through communication during office.
And it also didn't help Tex that you gave that last little bit connecting up to the exodus of General Kerensky, but you kind of set yourself up for this one. But I'm very glad to see that you followed through with this, because I'm I'm very interested to see this little portion of history because I've gotten little bits here and there, kind of like the more like the American Civil War and then the Succession Wars. But
Hours, I
again,
became distinctly
yapping.
aware that my audience wanted to know what in the hell became of the SLDF in the years and decades after the conclusion of the American
Yeah,
Civil
that
War,
would be a very
and how
pointy
they had
question.
fared in the deep periphery on their exodus from the inner sphere. The main question was this: how in the hell did the battle-scarred survivors of the legendary SLDF slowly turn into, well, these guys? Having heard your questions and acknowledging fully I left a great many threads hanging, I adjusted the scope of today's lecture accordingly. Today we are going to discuss the eventual fate of General Alexander Kerensky, his family, and the remnants of the SLDF who followed him into the unknown. We're going to talk about how, out there in the deepest reaches of the periphery, they forged their own destiny, and how the needs of survival changed them, and, well, how they eventually decided to return to the inner sphere to right past wrongs. So, that being said, welcome to the lecture on Exodus to Elementals, a relatively brief primer on the clans. Brief by my definition anyways. Then again, I suppose
Brief by Texas terms, which means 4 hours for the original video, and then probably 8 if I go on a rant, or just yapping, but we'll get there. Also, I love the Nova Cat in the background.
my tenure does allow me to say whatever the fuck I want. I must offer my sincerest apologies ahead of time for those who will want me to cover everything in fine detail, as the scope of this lecture only allows for me to hit the main points, and at times only briefly so. I assure you, many of these subjects will be covered in far greater detail as time and interest allows through future lectures. This lesson itself is intended to serve as a primer for understanding the clans and their ways. I apologize as well to those kept waiting for the development of this lecture, as I had taken a mandated sabbatical from these projects for my own well-being. So, without further ado, fill your glass and dim the lights.
That is a good thing.
And we shall
Always
begin.
take the rest when you need it.
To frame the history of what would eventually become the clans, we will need to go back and cover several key events which directly influenced General Alexander Kerensky's eventual exodus. I strongly feel that every step taken toward and later on the Exodus road plays a part in everything that follows. To accomplish this, we must wind the clock back to February of 2784, and as we had established near the end of the American Civil War lecture series, it was a dark time, full of uncertainty and fear. These were the final days of Star League. By February of 2784, the American Civil War was finally over, and Ameris had been dead for nearly 5 years, but the scars of his madness had still not healed. The successor states of the inner sphere were again at odds, turning their industries toward war, with the devastated hegemony in many other former Star League territories soon going to whoever laid claim to them first. The SLDF at this point was a bare remnant of its once former glory, and any notion of the pre-war Leviathan force was now consigned to a fate unknown. They had campaigned long and hard to rid the inner sphere of perhaps the worst tyrant he had seen, and through sheer determination and heroic sacrifice, they had achieved that aim at enormous cost. But peace would not last. The war
Never
had
does.
established a dangerous precedent for the history of the inner sphere, in that Ameris's actions had not only killed Richard Cameron, but the very notion of Star League. A usurper had cut the head off of not only a dynasty, but an ideology.
See, here's the thing with that. Even if you did have the idea of Star League, like even if that notion still existed, the problem is that you have 5 different states kind of bickering for power, and the only reason they agreed to it in the first place was because the other one's not getting as much power as the other. But now with a potential heir being from one of the successor states, kind of muddies the water, quite a bit. I'm not saying the Cameron line was a better idea. I'm just more saying conflict of interest is going to exist and the bounds of power is still not there. So unless you can convince them or have an outside ruler, you really don't have much to work with here. So unfortunate as it is, Star League was not going to be coming back at this time, I don't think, even if that ideology of Star League was more popular, which at this point kind of run through the mud with the American Civil War and their long and hard-fought campaign on Kerensky's part. He did what needed to be done, but that doesn't change that fact, unfortunately.
Maris had proved that a House Lord could, with sufficient preparation, resources, and guile, establish primacy over the inner sphere with a single master stroke of diabolical genius. Star League was at this point reduced to the bare remnants of the damaged hegemony, the SLDF, and whatever the House Lords had not claimed for themselves immediately following Amaris's demise. Without the stabilizing presence of the First Lord and the hegemony's power at the heart of the inner sphere much reduced in the wake of the conflict, a dangerous power vacuum had emerged. With no First Lord or royal dynasty to lead the government, the situation seemed increasingly hopeless. The functional head of the Star League government had been vacated, after all, in this case literally, and no agreed-upon means of how to restore the government post-war had yet been implemented.
See, this is something that they should have thought of, like, beforehand. I mean, honestly, yeah, your defenses are impregnable, but accidents happen. And to most people, like at the start of it, yeah, it just seems like a horrible attack happened. If you're on Terra at the time when this happened. Actually, I don't know if it's on Terra. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Accidents happen. So having a way to restore power and function should have been something that was put on the docket somewhere, but I guess I understand where the Star League was thinking that who's going to be that crazy enough to full on attack us, but here we are. So
There was, after
see how
all, no
this
known
plays out.
contingency plan for a scenario this unthinkable. The Cameron dynasty was,
Yes,
for all
that.
intents and purposes, removed from the inner sphere, and all they had stood for was, at most for now, a distant memory and a dead dream. That's not to say the powers to be hadn't tried to fix things, for immediately after the American Civil War, the Star League High Council had met to settle outstanding affairs of state and appoint a new First Lord. But through mutual distrust and endless debate on who would inherit the mantle of leadership, they had been unable to reach a lasting decision. And so the great lords of the inner sphere, after having been completely unable to agree on the actual issue of succession, pulled away from the negotiations and acted in unison to dissolve the Star League High Council in October of 2780. That is, after stripping General Alexander Kerensky of his titles and authority. For that,
See, here's where that kind of goes. Yes, you're all pulling back from the High Council. How did you think that was going to turn out for, like, again, this place has seen nothing but war. But this is going to incite more of that. Like, they probably knew that, but I just, like, I feel like that's a really bad decision, but stripping General Kerensky, yeah, that was going to be a political move, and that kind of would absolutely spiral things later on, as we've seen. But again, I feel like they made a lot of bad decisions here. Just generally, my first impressions on that part.
That issue was one of the few major things they had completely agreed upon, that the good general was no longer needed to wear the title of protector. The great lords of the Inner Sphere were in part terrified that the general would, through his legendary leadership and command of the SLDF, take control of Starleague if he were to remain in any position of significant authority.
Then I don't think they completely understood who General Kerensky was. I guess, to be fair, these are a bunch of warlords who wouldn't know what duty is, but that was the only thing that drove him, from what I can see. And having a unified Star League would be the only thing that he cared to do. Now, does that mean taking in the states by force, like the different bodies of the Inner Sphere? Now, that I don't know. I don't think so, personally. I don't know how that would play out, but I think that would be a different topic for a different day.
Also, very real concerns that even if they had agreed to appoint a new First Lord, Alexander Kerensky would shape the future for any political dynasty, as he had tried to do with the Camerons. The fact that Alexander Kerensky had brought Amaris to justice was lost on them. The fact that Kerensky had seen the evil in Amaris and acted upon it, that he had tirelessly crusaded to save the Star League from its greatest threat, that he had refused to back down, to give ground or give up through many hellacious campaigns, were all irrelevant considerations from the perspective of the High Council. To them,
Basically,
he was
point
just
and
a
paste what I
general,
said.
and to them, generals were easily replaced. But as history would have it, General Alexander Kerensky had other plans. After they dismissed Kerensky and his grand notions of rebuilding Starleague, they made one more fateful decision. The great House Lords of the Inner Sphere agreed that Jerome Blake would be appointed to the position of Starleague Minister of Communications in order to rebuild the Starleague's shattered communications network that they...
I'm sorry, but this face just screams. I'm gonna get so much flack for this, I'm sure. This looks like the face of somebody who would make you subscribe to Comstar, and it being the only option that you have, almost like a cult leader. Yeah, I'm getting cult leader vibes from. And what's funny is, this wasn't even his fault. Like, I get done saying all of that, right? But ironically enough, it wasn't even him that started the whole Comstar, you have one choice, pay your bills side of the business or cult. Is it a cult with a business or a business with a cult? I guess it's one and the same. I don't know. But yeah, like, he kind of gives me that vibe. And I'm not entirely sure if that's good or a bad thing considering what happened with Comstar later. But again, rants and yapping. Let's move
all
on.
relied upon. The great houses all needed the HPG network, which had been nearly destroyed during the war, and couldn't trust anyone other than a dedicated neutral party to oversee it. This decision would have far-reaching consequences of its own, but I will get to that lesson in time. And after those few decisions on which they could reach consensus, they summarily dissolved the High Council, telling the Inner Sphere via broadcast that future compromise was impossible on the issue of succession. With that done, they then left for their own holdings to prepare for the power struggles to come. To the High Lords,
Oh, yeah.
Starleague was now dead and buried, and the future of their houses was now firmly in their own hands. Privately, the Great Lords had decided for themselves that each of them was the rightful inheritor of Starleague, being that there can be only one First Lord. The solution to this disagreement would in time be solved in the standard manner common to the Inner Sphere: total war. Their inability to give ground, to find commonality in these dire times, and their greed and avarice had set the stage for generations of inter-house conflict and served as the direct catalyst to the 4 great succession wars which would follow. But despite being dismissed from his role as protector, General Kerensky still hadn't given up hope. For years, he would exhaustively try and fail to reconvene the Great Lords, spending his time shuttling between the various factions, meeting with them individually.
So in the last like video I did on one of Tex's videos, I was wondering about the flickering here. This is a small point, but still. That was to indicate that it's a long-range transmission, as somebody pointed out in the comments. And I want to say thank you to, I don't remember who made that comment, but I wanted to bring that up and say that that was what was going on here. So thank you for letting me know on that front. Yeah, so far this has been a really good recap of what happened towards the end of the Immersive War Part 2 video, and kind of like what happened to the Star League towards that point.
In order to bring them together once more, to find any common ground for negotiation and perhaps restart the spark of Star League. He tried to show them that as a people united once more under a single cause, they could potentially provide a new, wonderful age of progress and plenty to their people. Or at the very least, they could recover from the generation of war the Inner Sphere had just crawled out of. Minimally, Kerensky was trying to at least prevent the slow slide into war he felt was coming. Perhaps Kerensky wanted to feel that all he and his men had sacrificed for was not in vain. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Inner Sphere nobles being what they are, one by one they had opted to ignore the great general, and when he had finally exhausted every last option for a lasting diplomatic solution, Alexander Kerensky knew what he had to do. Keep in mind that he alone was still at this point provisionally in command of the single largest military the Inner Sphere had, and most of them were still willing to do whatever the hell the great general said was necessary, even if it meant going to war once more. And that course of action had indeed been suggested, for General Aaron D. Chevalier, Alexander Kerensky's right-hand man and trusted confidant, had forwarded the thought that maybe the SLDF should solve the problems of the Inner Sphere by doing away with these petty nobles and their political aspirations once and for all.
See, the problem with that is that you go right into the trap of the Inner Sphere. The crux of the issue is that the Inner Sphere will always go to war. And unfortunately, that doesn't usually go well, and it usually never ends. Like, the bloodshed never ends. And unfortunately, it would just repeat all over again. That's if they were successful. So I think General Kerensky made a good call here, after exhausting like every other diplomatic solution.
Chevalier told Kerensky that the troops stood ready to follow him to the gates of hell if need be. The plan would have been, presumably, to use the full might of the SLDF to swiftly neutralize the fighting strength of the great houses, to keep peace in the interim, and then restart Star League from the ground up without the issue of shit-tier nobility ruining everything. And to that proposal, being offered the opportunity to use the SLDF against the Inner Sphere to provisionally save it, to take charge and hold power over the entire Inner Sphere as a guiding hand, Kerensky had said no. I think it shows extraordinary character and mindfulness that after all he'd suffered, he was unwilling to become a tyrant to fix the situation. After all, to replace a tyrant with a tyrant would only serve as a terrible precedent for future generations. And so, on 14th February 2784, General Kerensky briefed the assembled officer corps of the SLDF in an empty warehouse on Terra. It was, by design, a secret meeting, and wisely so, for what the general proposed would be seen as nothing short of treasonous against the Star League government. That is, if you could still consider Star League an actual government at that point. All of his other options exhausted or unthinkable, he fully intended to take the SLDF beyond the reach of any of the great houses and their territorial aspirations. He wanted to spare the men and women of the SLDF from having to play a part in the next great war, to spare the citizens of the Inner Sphere from the ruinous firepower of the Star League Defense Force, and perhaps in the process, force the great lords of the Inner Sphere to rethink what they were planning on doing. General Alexander Kerensky felt it was his solemn duty and the duty of his officers to take the SLDF completely out of the equation. And while many felt the Exodus plan as presented was the most ethical, moral, and dutiful choice remaining to them at this point in time, some officers felt their duty was to stay and defend at least a portion of what they'd fought so long for. There was no dispute that the time to decide was now upon them, for the coming storm was obvious to those officers present at this final meeting of the assembled SLDF. The great houses had already made private and public overtures to recruit from their forces to bolster growing house armies. To his credit, General Alexander Kerensky allowed the soldiers of the SLDF to make up their own choices regarding their future, for he could not in good faith force them to obey. After all they had suffered, and the high cost of their victory over Amaris, he felt it best for each officer and each soldier to choose for themselves what course they would follow. And the choices at this point were rather grim. Either stay in the increasingly unstable Inner Sphere to make a future among the ruins, waiting for the war or wars to come, or commit to the Exodus and hope for the best. And when the votes were finally tallied, fully 80% of the assembled forces opted to follow Kerensky's plan and leave. For those opting to join the Exodus operation, the choice to follow the general was perceived as wiser than throwing their future plans in with any of the great houses. After all, they joined the SLDF to serve Star League as a whole, not the territorial ambitions of any particular house. Even if Star League was now a mere idea supported by the crumbling infrastructure of the mauled hegemony, much of the SLDF felt that continuing to serve its ideology was a far better option and potentially a more noble choice than serving as cannon fodder in the wars to come.
And you're trying to save the Inner Sphere. And really, at this point, it went from you're saving the Inner Sphere from itself to we're trying to limit the damage at this point because it is coming. The houses are trying to take the seat over the Star League, but unfortunately, it really isn't going to do them any good anyways, because nobody's going to recognize that power at this point, I wouldn't imagine, but I don't know. Maybe Tex will mention that.
It is also worth
further.
noting the cost of the Amaris Civil War. The men and women of the SLDF carried it with them. The war had made an indelible mark upon them all. War has...
Is it just me, or is this soldier one eye here, and then just the nose here? Like, it doesn't quite look right. Like, I know that's not, like, that's supposed to be the hand here, but, like, it just looks like his eyes just popped out of sheer stress about that particular mech or tank that they were piloting, just getting a shell real too close to the tank, blew up their buddy beside them, but not them, and they have to live with that now. I know I say that so matter-of-factly, but, like, I mean, there's a reason why this made it into the video game in the first place, or into the story in the first place. So, again,
a cruel way of stripping the civilization from a soldier, and piece by piece many of them were reduced to feeling they had nothing left but the uniform they wore. Returning to civilization for many was an unwelcome culture shock. The greatest casualty of the American Civil War inflicted on the SLDF was perhaps being ultimately reminded of the civilized versions of their past selves. Staying in uniform provided them with a necessary sense of identity and belonging that they desperately needed after all they'd suffered, as many of them now knew no home but the SLDF, no family but their fellow comrades in arms, their brother or sister in uniform. It is no wonder that many saw the Exodus as the best option they had. Most of them had nothing left to lose at this point, but not all would choose to see it this way. Some would refuse to leave and opt to stay in the inner sphere on their own terms. Of the SLDF 12th Corps, the 151st Royal Battletech Division, the infamous Ulysses S. Grant Division itself, had opted to stay under the outspoken commander Lauren Hayes, who was, from the very start, a hard critic to the idea of picking up and leaving. And Major General Lauren Hayes had her reasons. She possessed extraordinary conviction in her beliefs. She was a Star League Major General and had assumed division command after seeing her commanding officer cut down in the brutal Canopus campaign. During the conflict she led from the front and a battle master, taking to the field through Operations Chieftain and the final liberation of Terra. Seriously wounded in combat and losing a hand from a direct hit to the cockpit, she never gave up field command and was only fitted with a prosthetic once Amaris was dead and his empire a smoking crater. She was an idealist who saw abandoning their duties and to flee the increasingly unstable political situation as the death knell of the inner sphere and a betrayal of everything Star League stood for.
I get the conviction, and she is absolutely right to feel that. I don't know if staying behind and watching the flames was a good idea, though. Like, here's the thing. The fuse is already lit, and all the diplomatic solutions are already out the window at this point. And what are you hoping to achieve by staying behind? Again, she's right to feel that, and she's right to stay. But how do you plan to make that difference? That's kind of the question I would ask her if such a conversation could be had. You know what I mean, right? But
despite their differences of opinion, however, Kerensky saw in her a glimmer of promise, and in her idealism a semblance of hope for any who opted to stay behind. Hoping in part to preserve a part of Star League in the inner sphere, a deal was brokered, a compromise of sorts between General Kerensky, General Hayes, and Jerome Blake. Those under her command who wanted to stay would join the last vestiges of the Star League government. Jerome Blake was the newly appointed, and as history would have it, final communications director of SL Comnet, and he had immediate need of significant forces to defend his holdings. And so Alexander Kerensky bartered the loyalty of the 151st Royal Battletech Division to Jerome Blake to become the military arm of SL Comnet, soon to be Comstar, who would in turn keep a small piece of Star League alive in the heart of the inner sphere, if secretly. I believe the hope at this time was that if Blake's network could maintain communications and information flowing, the barest civility of Star League could potentially endure. Perhaps the promise of a brighter future could in time follow. However, with the value of the HBG network being what it is, Blake knew he would need a mailed fist to hammer at anyone seeking to impede the free flow of communications, data, and information. Further, this agreement between the SLDF and Comstar served another purpose. Blake could keep everything on the sly until the Exodus fleet had left, and then cover it up from there. I realize I did cover this briefly during the end of the American Civil War lecture series, but the reason I bring this up again is that this small and mostly forgotten act, the seeding of what would become Comstar with vastly powerful forces, is something that lets us see into Kerensky's mindset. by setting up small parts of the Star League and the SLDFs to survive at the heart of the inner sphere in secret to protect the last vestiges of government, speaks to me that he hoped that maybe, someday, perhaps in a better future, he or his forces may in some way return to restore the former glory of Star League. I believe it speaks to the merits of Kerensky's character that while extensive preparations were made to leave the crumbling inner sphere behind, he was also prepared for a way home when the time was right.
I think it's also that he wanted he wanted Starleague to survive in either fashion and support the people around him that have that same goal in mind. I realize the way that I say that doesn't quite make sense to what I'm trying to say, but regardless, I think that he wanted to keep Starleague alive, and having those two fledgling bits of the Star League allows it to survive if out of the hands of the great houses, which would use a lot of that weaponry to blow each other up. So I think it's a very clever idea and ingenious for, again, a general who's proven time and time again he has a lot of good strategies.
Tragically never lived to see the end result of his romantic optimism, or how by giving Comstar elite military forces he would inadvertently be shaping the future in ways he could never fathom. The departure of the 151st Royal Battletech Division, and those who sided with General Hayes, was the first major fracturing of Kerensky's command.
See, I want to point out that one part about inadvertently setting up Comstar and what they would go on to do with that. I don't think anybody could have predicted the third, what is it called? Excuse me. Third order effect, or maybe even fourth at this point, effect that would have on the inner sphere. I don't think anybody could have seen that coming.
Second would come shortly thereafter. Some people decided to stay because they'd had their share of time in uniform and wanted a piece of the action for themselves. Realizing the economy of the inner sphere was gearing up for the mother of all wars, they opted to put their long-honed battlefield skills on the open market. Several pieces of the SLDF knew full well that the inner sphere's chief product was war, and that the great lords needed little, if any reason, to slug it out. And so these people realized that their unique skill sets, hard won on the battlefield, could provisionally make them exceptionally wealthy. Numerous mercenary units formed from the various combat commands of the SLDF who had opted to not partake in the exodus, among them the infamous Eridani Light Horse, the 4th Tau Ceti Rangers, and the Screaming Eagles. Many of these units and others would serve with the utmost distinction until meeting the SLDF again.
See, I want to point something out for a second. It makes you wealthy, okay? It does. You also get a couple of houses that are just like, we don't like you. We will shoot on sight and try to end you in game, right? And you also get houses that just go, oh yeah, we'll pay you, wink wink, wink wink. And then once you do the job, they're just like, well, you see, here's the thing. We wanted to do the job, could have done it, didn't want to waste the time. Also, we're not paying you. Blast into the grave, have them fill that over real quick, smooth that over, and then job's done. You didn't have to pay anybody. And well, there's a set of mechs and pilots that aren't going to your enemy. So the inner sphere is high risk, high reward in this time period.
Followed General Alexander Kerensky away from the coming conflagration. From available records surviving from this time, I can say with some certainty the breakdown is as follows: 32 Battletech divisions, 76 infantry divisions, and 63
That is
independent
a
regiments,
lot of
combat
mechs.
commands, irregulars, and volunteers. This is a force of almost 6 million men and women, plus their equipment. 1/3 of those personnel were regular frontline soldiers,
Crazy.
with the rest now being their support staff, scientists, loyalist Starleague bureaucrats, plus other remnants of the now dissolved Starleague government. Once finally ready and assembled in their staging areas, the fleet itself was 1,392 jump ships, escorted by an armada of 402 warships. Between them, they had a total drop capacity of 5,000 first-rate dropships. Even diminished as they were from pre-war strength, this fleet was the single largest concentration of force currently present in the Inner Sphere. Large as this force was, moving through the increasingly contested Inner Sphere took enormous care, and would have been fundamentally impossible without the full compliance of what would become Comstar. Still, the great houses of the Inner Sphere understandably grew nervous when Kerensky's massive fleet arrived in system, and despite the persistent communications difficulties on the still damaged HPG network, the sporadic rumors of Kerensky's massive fleet moving through the Inner Sphere persisted. When signaled directly or asked what his intentions were, General Kerensky would respond the fleet was on extended maneuvers, an excuse most decided to believe, because they couldn't do a goddamn thing about it.
Extended maneuvers. That is the most that's a stretch of the truth that it's almost a lie, but it's not a lie. Everyone knows that the general's full of it. But when he's flying through the system with enough warships to basically annihilate a planet if it looks at him funny, yeah, there's nothing you can do about that. And to be fair, he's not lying. That's the best type of correct, right?
On the 8th of July, the Exodus order was given, and the fleets jumped. They made their way through the territory of the Draconis Combine, headed straight for the periphery. Along the way, any SLDF holding, base, warehouse, or shipyard they encountered would strip completely of useful resources before moving on. From New Samarkand, the fleet assembled again, and Kerensky made a last choice before leaving the Inner Sphere forever. He followed the suggestion of one of his rank-and-file soldiers and donated the remains of Stefan Amaris to the New Samarkand Medical School.
Yeah, so we're gonna let a bunch of we're just gonna let a bunch of nerds in the biology class just carefully dissect Amaris for various organs and learn how the human body works before they go off to do their well, what is it called? Like basically like internship. I think it's like I forget. I've never gone to college. I took a couple of college classes, but like every time I applied to or wanted to apply to a college, I just went, I want to be in IT. I basically learned everything I need to. I have my certifications. Why am I looking into this again? Just so I can show a company I have a piece of paper. This is not about that. We're already going to have an hour-long video for this as is. But yes, I do think it's funny that a bunch of lab students are going to be dissecting Amaris.
His corpse would serve as a training tool for aspiring doctors who wanted to see what the insides of a tyrant looked like. On November the 5th, the fleet began leaving the system. The last ship to jump out was Kerensky's own flagship, the McKenna's Pride, itself now an ancient relic of Starleague. As far as Inner Sphere historical records allow, the fleet was last spotted over Gutara 5. Shortly thereafter, they faded into memory. That is to say, from Innersphere historical records, they cease to exist for the most part, but some would.
You see, I'm gonna love the Inner Sphere's reaction to this, I'm sure. I'm betting the House Lords are just sitting here going, what do you mean? What do you mean? What, over a thousand warships just picked up and left without really so much as a peep? Like, yes, you do have various local reports, but what are they gonna do about it? They're lucky if they have a buoy just out in space to protect them from the occasional drop ship coming to raid their property. Like, they're not prepared for that. And the APG network outage basically means nobody knows until, yeah, we're just missing like 80% of the Navy, the mechs, the people, the supplies, all just gone. Like, they just packed up and like Houdini and just popped out of existence. So this is gonna be
Always
cool.
wonder where they had gone. The great houses, upon realizing that the excuse of extended maneuvers were in fact nothing of the sort, were furious Kerensky had left. But they now had their own problems. They were already in the planning stages for what would become the First Succession War. As such, they had more immediate concerns than the weapons, advanced technology, and warriors now outside their reach. And with that simple consideration, the Inner Sphere turned its gaze inward, with each successor state now eyeing the other as potential territorial acquisitions. As an ancient Terran philosopher has said, war is nothing more than a continuation of politics by other means. What would follow would certainly be that, and more. Soon enough, there would be a war, the likes of which no one had ever seen, and 3 more after that, to prove in my humble opinion one thing. In all likelihood, Alexander Kerensky was probably the last greatest hope the Inner Sphere ever had of a lasting if not permanent peace, and now that he had gone, it would soon begin to finally fall apart. But the story of the SLDF doesn't end there. The end of the SLDF starts where the map to civilization ends, the deep periphery. We're going to have to talk about the Exodus Road.
Oh. This ought to be interesting.
Throughout history, there has always been the edge of the map, the frontier, that place where all knowledge of what may lay beyond being the providence of rumor, superstition, and fear. During the early age of sail on ancient Terra, mankind, not knowing what perils lay beyond the edge of the known world, would draw great beasts there and say, "Here be dragons." To cross into the unknown, and what lay beyond has always been the providence of the crazy or desperate or those without other options. And fate had made General Alexander Kerensky precisely that sort of man. And so, the enormous Exodus fleet made careful progress into unknown territory. The deep periphery was at best partially charted space. Long ago, the Inner Sphere had stopped putting big money into programs of deep space exploration, instead opting to improve the holdings they had or fight over them. It is believed that General Alexander Kerensky only had a vague notion as to their eventual destination. Before departing, in preparation, he downloaded the total sum of data from the defunct Star League Astrological Mapping Corps, copying every last chart and map file, and then...
See, here's why I don't understand why the Inner Sphere would want to stop charting deep space. Because, yes, I always believe that you should make sure that everything at home is okay before spending abroad. Apply that how you will to current political situation here, but yes, I believe you should have every single planet in your system in a good state. Like, everyone's fed, everyone's sheltered, everyone has jobs, making sure the economy is booming. Now, overall, you're doing well as a empire or governing body, whichever you'd like to put here. But by going into deeper space, you might get more resources on that other hand. And if you're doing well enough at home, which you should be, but the inner sphere is a bunch of dorks. And I'm totally saying that about Steiner because they might have some of my favorite mechs, like this Steiner Scout Lance, but they are as dumb as a bunch of rocks. So it's probably better that they did look inward at that point. But I really do think they would have found like more resources in deeper space. But what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? If House Steiner is about average when it comes to intelligence levels, you kind of know what you're dealing with here.
Destroyed the originals. He wanted to ensure none could follow them. But deep beyond the periphery was truly the unknown. And as such, any progress through this poorly charted and mostly unknown region of space came slowly as scouts had to find an optimal path for the fleet and then report back that it was truly safe. Alexander Kerensky was thorough in coordinating the massive fleet, driving scouts forward to find a path while directing warships and scouting jump ships to make up a substantial rear guard to ensure they weren't being tailed or followed. Random course corrections were routinely ordered to prevent any forces following their wake from guessing their final destination. Even garbage from the fleet was ejected jumps away from their actual course to prevent being tracked by what they left behind. If any.
So here's my question on that. Who in the inner sphere right now, anyways, like who in the inner sphere is going to take the time and try to follow you into deep space? Because at best, they're going to find a route. Okay. Now, they have to get all the way back to the inner sphere to report that. And any number of things can happen along the way. And on top of that, they have to go back and map all of this with a force that they just simply don't have because they're dealing with the rest of the inner sphere. Possible? Maybe. Improbable? I'm thinking so, but maybe I'm wrong on this one. But I also think that General Kerensky was smart in doing this. So it takes longer for the inner sphere to potentially find you if they do somehow come to a peaceful resolution.
Any vessel of this era ever did choose to try and follow the Exodus fleet, none ever reported back. But the inner sphere also had its hands full at this point, for General Kerensky's great concerns were sadly becoming prophetic. As a necessary side note, I must mention that the First Succession War, starting in 2786, utilized the full arsenals of the Great Houses and turned into a 34-year-long nightmare, which claimed human lives by the billions. It is accordingly no great surprise that the forces of the Great Houses, while tremendously upset at the exodus of the SLDF, dedicated few, if any, resources in trying to follow them. They had their own fucking problems by the megaton. But I guess that's what happens when you throw the rules of warfare out the window and decide to settle things with every weapon you've got. The total disregard for human life and reckless lack of constraint in the conduct of the First Succession War would result in the technological base of the inner sphere degrading significantly.
See, I'm an inner sphere lass, very much so. However, I think the clans had the right idea with a trial of possession or a batchall. I understand where they're just like, we want to fight in this area and not damage any of the surrounding equipment. So at least we can duke it out and have our issues resolved on the battlefield. But we don't have to destroy everything else around it. In a vacuum, this makes sense. I realize outside of that, there is a lot of issues with everything got to do with that, including the clans. So I get the idea. Unfortunately, they took it way too far. I guess it's how the old saying goes. The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Through their violent excess, they erased many centuries of progress and a few short decades of intense warfare. In the history of the Inner Sphere, violence was never the answer. Violence is a question, and the answer is inevitably yes. As the Inner Sphere began to slide into eventual war, the Exodus fleet had its own significant trouble. Despite careful preparation and well-trained crews, many ships were tragically lost through misjump or catastrophic drive failure. Time and again, vessels would wait at the jump point for ships that failed to ever materialize. One by one, the vessels of the Great Fleet were being whittled away by what amounted to error and malfunction. Many of the ships in the SLDF were by now ancient, battle-scarred vessels held together far beyond their design lifespan, with scavenged parts and jury-rig repairs. As a noteworthy example, the McKenna warship class, once the pride of the SLDF Navy, was well over 130 years old as a design. And after the hard operations tempo of the Ameris Civil War, multiple refits, and hasty wartime repairs, it was no wonder these vessels were beginning to show their age. Shortages in supplies and necessary materials resulted in stringent rationing and a universally low standard of living among the forces of the Exodus fleet, but morale was initially quite high. Most believed in General Alexander Kerensky enough to risk death for decades up to this point, so the perils of the unknown were just yet another challenge to overcome. However, as fate would have it, this road would be longer than they had ever expected, and after a few months of jumping into the unknown, and now with the Inner Sphere far, far behind them, some began to express significant doubt. Tensions grew slowly at first between the crews, between the civilians and the military. Some began to consider that the Inner Sphere was far from perfect, but it was.
See, my question is, with all this, and this kind of makes or breaks this entire thing, where are they going that would have the infrastructure or potential infrastructure to repair, replace any of the technology, the quality of life that they would experience in the Inner Sphere? Because that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. Like, yes, this is an entire like, basically you have everything you need to start up a world from the ground up. However, I don't know necessarily where they intend to go that would be that good for them to have to go through all of this just to get to that particular planet or place. Because again, actually, no, it would be a planet. What am I saying? Okay, let's continue before I make even more a fool of myself.
Was at least civilization, and out here was anything but. With every jump they pressed on, the SLDF began to crack from these stresses, as more and more of the fleet wondered if leaving everything behind was really the best choice they could have made. Some, in the quiet darkness of space, and now with endless time to ponder the situation, wondered if they'd left for the wrong reasons. And so the seeds of doubt were planted deep in the fleet. Kerensky did what he could to hold them together, to remind them of their purpose. But for many, this journey was becoming a lengthy nightmare. A nightmare spent in cramped ship corridors with no news from home, or where they were headed, as one by one ships around them disappeared due to accident. The discomfort of severely cramped living and working conditions, the relatively few amenities, strict rationing, and the feeling of coming to terms with the choice they had made was continually weighing on the minds of the Exodus fleet. Random course corrections ordered by Kerensky to deter pursuit, ships being detached to go dump garbage far away from the route they intended to take, and similar extensive measures in covering their tracks continued to ensure a very slow pace of progress. While these measures were incredibly successful in covering their tracks, as even Comstar's intelligence service would find years later, these very precautions to safeguard their journey would result in such a slow pace of progress as to further add to the general worry that the Exodus was a faltering exercise in futility, not a planned military operation. Many began to fear that they were merely floating around in the periphery until they all died, got lost, or starved. Some
That actually does, again, not knowing the destination, or even if there is a destination for, it's not exactly what I mean, but like basically where if they actually get to where I'm wondering if they're going to go, kind of does set the stage for a fracturing SLDF at this point.
began to believe this was a trip to nowhere, a living purgatory spent between old bulkheads, worse company, and rapidly deteriorating morale. Alexander Kerensky did his best to lead people through the Exodus, shuttling between ships at every jump, taking time to explain why it was a far better choice to leave than pound the great house lords of the inner sphere into submission. He took time to listen, to patiently hear their concerns, and showed extraordinary resolve in maintaining morale as best he could. But
And this is the sign of a good leader. Somebody who goes around and actually hears you out and is there all the time during all this. It's a very difficult thing to do, but connecting with your people is one of the biggest ways to show that you care. That's my 2 cents on it, anyways.
in the end, he was only one man. While Alexander Kerensky knew how difficult it was to hold people together through the uncertainty and chaos of a long war, he found it all that much harder to hold them together through peace, especially when all there is to do is wait and see what the next jump brings. This wasn't helped by the general's own family fucking things up. At the start of the Exodus, General Alexander Kerensky revealed he had a family. He'd been married for nearly 2 decades by the start of the Exodus, but had kept that fact hidden save for a few trustworthy souls. The years leading up to the Emotes Civil War and the time following it had been chaotic. To protect his family from reprisal, he had kept their place in the inner sphere a necessary secret.
Yep. And that is a very good thing to do, because you don't know who's going to use that against you, and you don't know who's going to cause you that pain to mess up. I'm kind of wondering where they're going to go with this.
His wife and his 2 sons had been in Moscow during the Emotes occupation, and their anonymity had most certainly assured their survival. Trapped on Terra during the war, Katyusha had bravely resisted Emotes' occupation, committed herself to sabotaging the regime at every chance she had while bitterly fighting for her family's survival. She was tough as nails, was nearly captured on a handful of occasions, and even shot twice. Throughout, she maintained a spirit of defiance and resolved, for her family's sake, to never give up. But while Alexander Kerensky's wife Katyusha was a bedrock of emotional and moral support, his sons were a colossal pain in his ass. I have, to this point, been largely unbiased, but when it comes to the general's sons, I can't guarantee to hold my tongue.
You can feel the anger in his voice. And also helps that the editor puts in the spooky music to kind of emphasize the point. I see you, editors. I see you. I may not know who you are, but I know that you're doing a very good job in setting the tone, setting the emotion for this scene. I appreciate you. I know not a lot of people do, but thank you.
They are responsible for their actions and everything that followed. You have been warned. Ruin.
Again, I'm going to refer back to what I said earlier. Please insert modern day political example, because there's one going on right now that would be a very good example, but also I want this relatable to anybody watching this in the future. You see, it's evergreen political nightmares. You're welcome.
So I suppose this is where I introduce Nicholas and Andrei Kerensky.
Oh no.
Yes, I know in agreed upon sources it's put as Andrei, but I'm not going to say that, because my brain will autocorrect it every time, and while I would like to label Nicholas and Andrei as the goofus and gallant of the Kerensky lineage, the comparison would be tragically incorrect. Also, I think the clanners in the audience would bachelor me the moment I stopped talking in order to claim me a bondsman in order to tell them bedtime stories until I perish.
Yes, they would. Yes, they would. And I can get a source on this later on, because I do know a clanner. I do know a clanner that would that can confirm this. I will put it in the edit afterwards.
So in the interests of a temporary peace, I think I'd rather label them as what they were, flawed men in the shadow of a truly great one. Nicholas Kerensky was the elder son of General Kerensky and of near zero historical significance at this point in his life. Not saying he was crap, but comparing him to his father is like comparing raisins to wine. Same ingredients, but far different outcomes. As a person, Nicholas Kerensky was known principally for being exceptionally manipulative, especially where his own legacy was later concerned. Clan records revere him as being a near saint, but he had a major hand in writing his own legacy. Further, I suspect that his creative historical revisionism was exercised to enhance his standing, associate his legacy with the great accomplishments of his father, all the while downplaying his many faults. I feel that Nicholas Kerensky feared that history would realize he was nothing more than the troubled son of a great man, desperately trying to hold on to the significance of his legacy and through that ensure his own place in the spotlight. What I can say with any certainty is that he was only 2 when the Amer Civil War started, and only 16 when it ended, so any reports of him having played a significant role in the conflict are probably horse shit. However, records of his deeds...
I'm sorry. I have a picture in my head of this son of Kerensky here. In a mech, like what's the most generic, we'll say an assassin for the funnies, right? 40-ton mech, and this kid somewhere between the ages of 2 and 16 basically pulled like a prequel Anakin Skywalker, just piloting around the battlefield in an assassin, just blasting stuff and making his way into the history books from a young age. But I feel like we'd have some sort of record of that. So I don't think that's likely. It's a funny thought, but I don't think that happens. I think Tax is very right on this one.
From this time period are hard to find, as those who survived the Ameris occupation of Terra seldom spoke of the atrocities they endured. I believe this made a mark on him he would carry his entire life. He was a brash and headstrong man with a propensity to try to get his own way regardless of the consequences. As far as I am able to find, he trended towards sociopathic behavior with deep-seated emotional issues no doubt stemming from the horrors of the American Civil War. But more on that in a bit. Andrei Kerensky was Nicholas's brother and was the younger son of Katyusha and Alexander Kerensky. He was born on Terra but spent most of his childhood trying to survive in the shadow of Maris's security forces. By his adolescent years, he was fighting alongside local resistance forces from their Moscow base. I believe that he was, above all, quite humble and content to play whatever role history assigned to him. He was also a bit naive and trusting in the extreme, especially where his fellow SLDF personnel were concerned, and doubly so for his family. And it was through this trust he was directly manipulated by his brother Nicholas into encouraging the dissidents in the fleet to act on their desperate dissatisfaction. Did I mention Nicholas Kerensky was a manipulative sociopath? And we know how that typically plays out, right? What is known for certain is that...
Are you telling me that... Oh no, there's going to be a fracture of the SLDF in the middle of space? This can only go well, especially in tight quarters. That's going to be fun. And I know exactly how that's going to play out. You ever seen like the Americans go to war, right? The Civil War was the most bloodshed of any war, by a good margin. Oh, and that's the entire planet. Now apply this to Battletech standards, right? The SLDF and its ability to destroy people is on par with America in this analogy. And now they're giving each other the smoke. This can only go well.
Nicholas Kerensky used his brother Andrei to encourage those among the fleet who thought the exodus was a mistake into what would become an open mutiny. Why he did this is a bit harder to pin down, as the records of the event are probably revised by Nicholas himself and naturally paint this as the weakness of the men and women in question, not his own manipulation. Perhaps Nicholas felt it was time to take charge away from his aging father. Perhaps Nicholas felt it was now his destiny to lead the Exodus fleet to the Promised Land, as his father had led them through the war. Perhaps he was tired of not being the center of attention and wanted his moment in the sun to steer his own destiny for once. Perhaps Nicholas wanted to do away with these non-believers and call the fleet of the weak personnel lacking the necessary faith to proceed. I feel that Nicholas was fundamentally damaged and didn't know how trust worked. What is known is he pushed his younger brother into speaking with the disaffected officers and crews wanting to end the Exodus. And as such, I feel it is entirely fair to put the responsibility of what followed on him. After 14 long months of slowly jumping deeper and deeper into unknown space and with devious manipulation on behalf of Nicholas Kerensky, morale collapsed to a breaking point. It was in August of 2785 that things came to a head. Many were now openly concerned that the great general had zero plans other than keeping the fleet moving forward at any cost, one jump at a time. By this time, through urging by Andrei Kerensky on the orders and influence of his brother Nicholas, enough officers had decided mutiny was the best remaining course of action, and perhaps emboldened by the support of Alexander Kerensky's progeny, they acted. And the repercussions of the decision would prove remarkable. The Prince Eugen, a Texas-class battleship, openly broke from the fleet, announcing a plan to return to the inner sphere and whatever fate awaited them. They would not take a single jump further, nor would they obey any orders to return to the fleet. They were leaving on their own terms back to the inner sphere by the most direct course available. If this had been one of the multitude of scout vessels or light warships, none would have likely taken notice. This whole incident may have been chalked up to a misjump if they had chosen to simply disappear, but the Prince Eugen was a Texas-class battleship, one of 52 built pre-Ameris coup, and was now one of only 7 in existence. It was a significant vessel to break from the fleet, and perhaps due to her imposing status in the order of battle, she was joined by a small flotilla who had no intention of continuing the exodus any step further. In total, 8 other vessels followed suit in open mutiny. This mutiny's leader was Admiral Votok, who conspired with General Wilbur Brasso of SLDF Ground Command, among many other notable officers. These weren't simply green men shaky at the notion of deep space, but long-standing veterans who'd finally lost faith in what they thought was now a doomed endeavor. Their crews threw in with them because they too had suffered long campaigns and didn't want to die lost in space to what was now to them a thoroughly lost cause. General Alexander Kerensky wasn't going to allow the fleet to fracture, and so he acted immediately to end this threat. Rather than rush into a fight, taking it ship versus ship and risking damage to vessels he could not replace or properly repair, or worse, risk civilians being massacred in the crossfire, Kerensky made a calculated choice. Kerensky called in the one group he knew could get the job done right. He called on what remained of the best, the goddamn Black Watch.
Are we doing the bagpipes again? All right. I was not expecting the return of the Black Watch, but here we are.
Kerensky called Major Elizabeth Hazen of the Black Watch to his side and gave her orders to bring the ships back into the fold, to stop the mutiny and restore good order by bringing the mutineers to immediate military justice. To face off against the entirety of a mutinous warship flotilla, to combat its crew's Marines and support staff, Hazen took only a force of 160 Black Watch Marines. The crew of the Prince Eugen probably knew they screwed up the moment the drop pods hammered into its hull. Still, they had a distinct advantage in numerical superiority, years of training, and total familiarity with the vessels they'd operated through a long war. The Black Watch, however, had batshit crazy on their side. By this point, the battle-hardened veterans of the Black Watch were people who'd seen enough nukes to find them frankly fucking boring. So a zero-G space battle boarding action was a walk in the fucking park. With zero fucks given, with no mercy on offer, the Black Watch boarded the Prince Eugen, kicked the doors in, and proceeded to ventilate all opposition. They hammered through the corridors like the fist of an angry god. In record time, the Black Watch secured the vessel with ruthless efficiency, scouring the corridors of any resistance. After a furious firefight, the admiral in charge lay dead, and the ringleaders of the mutiny were captured relatively unharmed. The 8 other ships surrendered without a fucking shot, surrendering outright, absolutely terrified of the Black Watch and General Kerensky's wrath. Major Elizabeth Hazen dragged the surviving mutineers to a military court-martial held at the jump point out of system. The sentence was brutal. After all was said and done, all excuses heard and all defenses noted, every single officer at or above the rank of captain were summarily executed. Major Hazen handed down the orders herself, and General Kerensky made his son Andrei take part in the firing squad because of the key part he played in encouraging the dissenters. I feel that this was a tad unfair. As previously stated, Nicholas Kerensky had convinced Andrei to speak with the mutineers before they had acted, and employed to effect changes on the Exodus in order to perhaps steer it or take charge and play hero or prove to his father that he true was a great man.
I feel like this is going to have lasting consequences, and I think it's the linchpin that caused the clans to come into existence, but we'll see.
Nicholas Kerensky had then opted to stay in the shadows, content to watch things play out regardless of the consequences, and Andrei could have told everyone of Nicholas's part, of Nicholas Kerensky's meddling and plotting and manipulation, but he kept silent and refused to say an ill word about his brother's doing and took his punishment like a man. Nicholas Kerensky, meanwhile, admitted to nothing because above all he was concerned with his own survival at this point. He refused to tell his father what he had done and how he had manipulated his brother and taken advantage of the situation. I find those are the qualifications of a goddamn coward. But I digress. The fleet took the news of the attempted mutiny and the following reprisals rather hard. This, when compounded with the already negative morale within the Exodus fleet, resulted in an acute crisis of faith. This is because most people in the fleet could, on some level, understand why the mutiny happened. This was all beyond any reasonable time frame they could have ever conceived, as day by day they were jumping further and further off the damn map, deep into the unknown, and when somebody wanted to turn back for what seemed reasonable cause, the effect was brutal reprisal. That's not to say General Alexander Kerensky had shaky reasoning in this case. After all, any vessel that went back would inevitably give away the SLDF's position, or worse, add their firepower to what was undoubtedly an exceptionally unstable inner sphere. Additionally, the breakdown of morale in any fleet jeopardizes its well-being and cohesion. Still, not many shared Alexander Kerensky's convictions. Long journeys into the unknown do strange things to the human soul. General Alexander Kerensky realized the gravity of the situation, and that his sheer will wouldn't hold people together forever. He realized that hope was the surest medicine for these seemingly hopeless times, and so in the aftermath of the mutiny, he issued General Order 137 on the 5th of November, 2785. The combined address and military order laid the grounds for why they could not go back, and that they must instead task themselves with building a better future. At the core of what would later be called the Hidden Hope Doctrine lays the following passage.
Return to the inner sphere is impossible for us. Our heritage and our convictions are different from those we left behind. The greed of the 5 great houses and the council lords is a disease that can only be burned away by the passing of decades, even centuries. And though the fighting may seem to slow or even cease, it will erupt again as long as there are powerful men to covet one another's wealth. We shall live apart, conserving all the good of the Star League and ridding ourselves of the bad, so that when we return, and return we shall, our shining moral character will be as much our shield as our battle mechs and fighters.
The words were chosen carefully to remind people that this was their choice to prevent the greater potential damage to the inner sphere by staying. He reminded them that by their sacrifice, through committing to this exodus, to renewing their pledges to a noble cause, they were preserving, in some small way, the Star League, what it stood for. And by such noble conduct, they would distinguish themselves forever from the savages they left behind. With this order transmitted to the fleet, there was finally the establishment of something concrete. A foundation of belief was laid out using simple language that all could understand, no longer merely running from the inner sphere. They were going to build something new, something better. The reception to the order was everything General Kerensky could have hoped for the SLDF quickly took it to heart. It stood as a reminder of who they were and why they'd made this choice. For the weary fleet, it also provided necessary direction, and through that, it renewed their purpose. Privately, General Kerensky was wise enough in the domain of the human spirit to know full well that words were not enough in the long term, that sooner or later, the exodus had to come to an end. By 2786, tensions were again beginning to rise. People had faith enough, but it was being sorely tested. By this time, they had been gone from the inner sphere for nearly 2 long years. 2 years of endless jumping, of painstakingly covering their tracks, crammed into ships not designed for patrols this long, let alone extended deployment off the edge of the damn map. On the 24th of August, 2786, the fleet happened upon a godsend. Finally, after all their journey, far from the inner sphere, they found 5 worlds that were reasonably habitable. Finally, they had worlds of their own, and on these worlds, they would begin anew. Little did they know the trouble that would follow, for they had brought their ruination with them. General Alexander Kerensky announced to the fleet that they had finally reached their destination, that the long journey was over, and that the time to build was at hand. Soon after, the colonization of what would become the Pentagon Cluster began in earnest. While untamed and by Inner-Sphere standards marginal worlds at best, the Pentagon Cluster was ideal for colonization and exploitation for many reasons. The worlds were near perfect distance from each other for combined defense, trade, and resource sharing. As an added strategic bonus, they were shrouded from the inner sphere by the Caliban Nebula, located just a few jumps away. Not that the inner sphere was intent on sending ships out this far to search for them. At 1,300 light years from Terra, they were now far beyond where any man had gone before. And with colonization achieved, with renewed purpose, and with the hope of a new beginning, the peace they had sought for so very long finally looked possible. For nearly a decade, everything went well enough. From 2786 to 2794, there was a time of explosive development, of rapid expansion, and for many, finally, opportunities for healing. General Alexander Kerensky oversaw the creation of Star League in Exile, a provisional government designed to keep the dream alive, even if 1,300 light-years coreward of the inner sphere. It was a time of such prosperity that colonization efforts were soon enough directed to other worlds, namely the nearby stars of what was soon called the Kerensky Cluster. But it was not long before such prosperity would be challenged.
Oh no. Okay. So we've made it to the intermission. I think this is a good point to stop at. This has been a long roller coaster, and I'm kind of happy that we got to see a little bit of fracture at the SLDF in the Exodus corridor. Because, yeah, those people would be under a lot of stress, and I think that was a good, I guess, a good plot point. I don't know. I'm tired at this point. But I wanted to thank all of you pilots and mercs for watching, and you have yourselves a great day.